One moment of rage. One act of vengeance. That's all it takes to turn pain into purpose and justice into something far darker. Across ordinary neighborhoods, hospitals, classrooms, and homes, moments of humiliation, betrayal, and cruelty festered until they reached the breaking point. What followed were not random crimes, but calculated acts of retribution, where victims became executioners and reason vanished beneath the weight of revenge. This is when revenge wears the mask of justice. Rebecca Lawson was a name whispered with both reverence and fear through the corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center. A cardiac surgeon of almost mythic skill and an ego to match. She had saved hundreds of lives. But behind the surgical mask, she was hiding a dangerous secret. Arrogance, alcoholism, and a willingness to gamble with human life if it meant keeping her reputation intact. Among the nurses who worked beneath her was Nora Martinez, a young woman who had seen too much and had finally lost too much to stay silent. Her 8-year-old nephew, Miguel, had died on Rebecca's table just a year earlier, during what should have been a routine heart repair. Nora knew the truth. Rebecca had been drinking that day. She'd sipped vodka from a metal thermos during lunch, her hands steady, her voice confident, until a fatal slip of the scalpel punctured Miguel's aorta. The boy bled to death while Rebecca falsified the surgical notes, rewriting negligence into complications. When Nora tried to report her, she was fired, blacklisted, and branded a disgruntled nurse. That's when grief turned into obsession, and obsession became a plan. Months later, Nora found her chance. Rebecca arrived at a private clinic for a lucrative cosmetic procedure, pale and nauseous from food poisoning, but too greedy to cancel. As Rebecca lay on the gurney, IV fluids dripping into her arm, Nora calmly injected a syringe into the line. Potassium chloride, enough to stop a heart in less than a minute. Rebecca's monitor began to scream. Then silence. When asked why she did it, Nora's reply chilled the courtroom. She killed my nephew for money. I just made sure she never killed again. She was sentenced to life without parole, but to her, it was justice. Ethan Moore was once treated like family in the Weston household. He lived in their suburban mansion for nearly 3 years, working, helping, and eventually falling in love with their youngest daughter, Isabella Weston. Their love was genuine. But when Richard Weston, a wealthy and controlling businessman, found out, he strongly disapproved. The Westons believed Ethan wasn't one of them, not rich enough, not worthy enough. They forced the two apart, and Isabella obeyed. Ethan left the house without a word. No one knew that the day he walked out was the day something inside him broke. Months passed. On social media, Isabella posted photos with her new boyfriend, a medical student. She looked happy, radiant, free. But somewhere in a dim apartment on the edge of Chicago, Ethan sat alone, staring at those photos. And with every post, his love slowly rotted into something darker. Obsession, pain, and hate. He began writing in a small notebook, details about the Weston family, their routines, the layout of the house, every corner, every hallway, every insult he could never forget. And soon, the plan for revenge took shape. Ethan couldn't do it alone. He reached out to Ryan Cooper, an old friend drowning in debt and desperation. Ethan promised him a share of the money inside the Weston home once the deed was done. Ryan agreed, not out of loyalty, but out of greed. A deal was made, sealed not with ink, but with intent. It was a cold December night.
Snow covered Willow Creek Road like a white sheet of silence. Inside the Weston mansion, Christmas lights glowed softly through frosted windows. Isabella played the piano in the living room, a soft carol drifting through the air. Outside, two figures moved through the darkness, their footprints vanishing behind them. Ethan knew every inch of that house. The side door near the kitchen, the staircase to the second floor, the creak on the third step he used to fix for Mr. Weston. Once, those memories were warm. Now, they were coordinates for murder. By dawn, the Weston residence was silent. What happened that night would shake the entire Chicago suburb, a brutal massacre that left nearly the entire family dead. And the man responsible was the one they had once welcomed like a son. 3 days later, Ethan was arrested in a cheap roadside motel. In his room, police found an old box filled with photos of him and Isabella, and a single piece of paper that read, "I used to belong to them. They took everything from me. I only took back what was mine." At trial, Ethan said almost nothing. When asked why, he answered quietly, "I couldn't stand seeing her happy without me." The courtroom fell silent, a single sentence that froze every heart. A love once pure had turned to poison, and in that poison, humanity was lost. The media called it the Willow Creek Massacre, but locals gave it another name: the night love turned to ashes.
In a university dorm room lined with textbooks and empty coffee cups, jealousy took on a scientific form. Amanda Torres, 20, was a brilliant but struggling pre-med student. Her roommate, Bryce Chandler, had everything she didn't: wealth, charm, effortless success. But he also had one weakness: a severe peanut allergy. And Amanda had found her way to weaponize it. At first, it was subtle: peanut oil on his toothbrush, residue on his pillowcase, tiny doses that made him cough, wheeze, and doubt his own health. Then, during finals week, Amanda offered Bryce a homemade smoothie, the same one she'd laced with peanut butter hours earlier. He thanked her, smiled, drank it all. Minutes later, he was on the floor, gasping, searching for his missing EpiPen, the one Amanda had hidden earlier that morning. He looked up at her, eyes wide, lips turning blue. "Please, help me." Amanda didn't move. She simply turned a page in her textbook. When Bryce's body was found, it was ruled an accident, until investigators checked Amanda's browser history. How to induce fatal anaphylaxis. How long before peanut allergy kills? Undetectable poisoning. Revenge had never looked so clinical. On a quiet suburban street, Sarah Mitchell thought she had found peace. A small garden, a swing set, and 2 happy children. But for 3 years, her next-door neighbor Tessa Monroe turned that peace into a nightmare. Noise complaints, false CPS reports, poisoned pets, every act of harassment a little more vicious than the last. That Sunday afternoon, the final confrontation began over something as small as laughter. Tessa stormed out, screaming at Sarah's daughter for being too loud. Sarah tried to protect her, but Tessa grabbed the hose and sprayed them both with ice-cold water. Something inside Sarah broke. 3 years of fear, humiliation, rage. She shoved Tessa, just once, but Tessa stumbled, fell, and struck her head on the concrete. The crack echoed through the yard. Sarah froze. Then she made the choice that turned an accident into a crime. She waited 15 minutes before calling for help. Tessa Monroe was dead by the time paramedics arrived. Experts later said those 15 minutes could have saved her life. The jury called it negligent homicide. But for Sarah, it was the day her silence finally spoke. The late afternoon sun hung low over the small parish of Dak Mat, painting the red earth of Vietnam's central highlands in gold and blood. It was January 29th, 2022, a Saturday. The air was thick with incense and the faint echo of children's laughter outside the chapel walls. Inside, Father Joseph Tran Ngoc Thon, a 41-year-old Dominican priest, was preparing to hear confessions before evening mass. He had done this countless times before, but that evening felt different, quieter, almost sacred in its stillness. He walked slowly toward the confessional, his white habit brushing lightly against the wooden pews. The chapel was simple, built by the local ethnic community, bare walls, a cross carved by hand, a few flickering candles near the altar. Yet to him, it was a cathedral. "Lord," he whispered, "grant me the grace to serve you in every soul I meet." He didn't know that within the next hour, he would offer not just prayers, but his life. Father Joseph had spent years serving remote villages in Kon Tum province, places where paved roads ended and faith was often the only light people had. His parishioners were poor farmers and mountain tribes, men and women who lived quietly, tending rice fields by day and gathering to pray at dusk. He loved them deeply. He knew every face, every story. He baptized their children, blessed their harvests, and buried their dead. His mission wasn't glamorous, but he never wanted anything else. To him, every confession was holy ground. Every sinner was a soul returning home. That night, after a long day of ministry, he settled into the small confessional booth. Outside, the sounds of the jungle mixed with the low hum of evening prayer. A few villagers waited patiently in line, clutching their rosaries, whispering silent pleas for mercy. And then, the door creaked open. A man entered. He wasn't one of the regulars. Father Joseph smiled gently. "Peace be with you," he said softly in Vietnamese. But the man didn't respond. He was trembling, his breathing sharp and uneven. There was something in his eyes. Not guilt, but confusion and rage. Father Joseph leaned forward, sensing distress. "My son," he said quietly, "do not be afraid. God listens to those who seek forgiveness." The man's hand moved suddenly. A flash of metal caught the candlelight. There was a scream. Then chaos. Witnesses later said it happened in seconds, a blur of motion, a knife, a gasp, and then silence. When the villagers rushed inside, Father Joseph was on the floor beside the confessional, blood pooling beneath him. His white habit was stained crimson. His eyes were still open, gazing upward toward the crucifix. Beside him, the attacker, a mentally unstable man, was restrained by parishioners. His face twisted in confusion and terror, as if he himself didn't understand what he had done. Someone screamed for help. Another began to pray. But for Father Joseph, it was too late. He was still breathing, faintly, as fellow priests and villagers knelt beside him. One of them, Father Peter, lifted his head and whispered, "Joseph, hold on, we're here." Father Joseph's lips moved slowly. No anger, no fear, just a whisper. "Forgive him." And then silence. Outside, the sun had already set. The night had come, but in the chapel, one light burned brighter than ever, a single candle flickering beside the crucifix, its flame steady and unwavering. That was the night the people of Dak Mat lost their shepherd, but it was also the night his faith became eternal. Because even as he lay dying, he spoke the same words Christ had once spoken on the cross, words that turned violence into mercy and death into victory. Long before that tragic night in the highlands, before the blood and the candles, there was just a boy from central Vietnam, a boy who couldn't stop staring at the stars. Joseph Tran Ngoc Thon was born in 1981 in a modest village not far from Da Nang. His parents were devout Catholics who had lived through war and poverty, clinging to faith as their only certainty. Their home had no luxury, just bamboo walls, a thatched roof, and a crucifix above the family table. Every evening, when the sky turned indigo and the crickets began their songs, young Joseph would kneel beside his mother as she prayed the rosary. He didn't always understand the words, but he felt something powerful in them, something alive. His mother used to tell him, "When you pray, God listens. Even when you hear nothing, He answers." Those words never left him. As he grew older, Joseph showed an unusual quietness, not shyness, but reflection. He was the kind of child who noticed things others ignored, the loneliness of an old man sitting alone after Mass, the struggle of farmers hauling rice under the sun, the small joys hidden in ordinary suffering. When he was 15, he told his parish priest he wanted to become a Dominican, a member of the Order of Preachers. "Why the Dominicans?" the priest asked, half expecting a childish answer. Joseph thought for a long moment. "Because I want to understand God and help others understand Him too," he said. The priest smiled. It wasn't the answer of a child. The path wasn't easy. The 1990s were years of quiet hardship for the church in Vietnam. Religious life meant simplicity, sacrifice, and sometimes suspicion. But Joseph was steadfast. At the seminary, while other students debated theology and philosophy, he would spend hours in the chapel after lights out, praying in the dim glow of the tabernacle. He wasn't the best speaker, nor the most charismatic student, but everyone noticed something about him, a stillness, a gentle patience that drew people in. When others grew tired, he listened. When they argued, he stayed silent and smiled. His classmates would later recall, he never preached loudly, he lived his homily. After years of study and discernment, he took his final vows as a Dominican friar. Then came ordination, a moment that felt both solemn and unreal. As the bishop's hands rested on his head, Joseph closed his eyes and whispered the same prayer he'd said since childhood. "Lord, make me useful." He didn't dream of cathedrals or prestigious assignments. He asked to serve wherever priests were needed most, even in forgotten corners of the country where poverty was deep and roads were made of dust. The Dominicans sent him to Con Tum province, a rugged, mountainous region in Vietnam's central highlands. To some, it was an exile. To him, it was a promise. The people of Con Tum were simple, strong, and full of faith. They farmed cassava and rice, lived in wooden stilt houses, and gathered at dusk to pray by candlelight. For many, Father Joseph was the first priest they'd ever had full-time. He rode a small motorbike from village to village, through mud, through rain, over hills slick with red clay, carrying the Eucharist in a small metal case pressed close to his chest. When he arrived, the children would run to greet him. The elders would smile and clasp his hands. He would always laugh, brushing the dust from his habit. "The road may be long," he'd say, "but grace travels faster." He fixed leaky roofs, patched broken fences, and brought medicine when no doctor would come. He wasn't just a priest, he was a brother, a teacher, a friend. At night, when he finally returned to his room, he often found muddy footprints on the floor from his own shoes. He would look at them, tired but content, and whisper, "These feet belong to you, Lord." Those who knew him say he had a sense of humor, light but deep. He loved coffee, strong, black, unfiltered, and had a laugh that could cut through even the darkest day. He never sought attention. He lived simply, with one pair of sandals, a worn-out Bible, and a heart that belonged entirely to his people. Father Joseph was not a man of many words, one parishioner later recalled. But when he looked at you, you felt seen, really seen, as if God himself was listening through his eyes. In early 2022, he was assigned to the small parish of Dak Mat, deep within the highlands. It was a humble community with no priest for months. When he arrived, he simply said,
I'm here to serve. He had no idea how short that service would be. Still, he gave everything. Day and night, he baptized babies, blessed fields, taught catechism under open skies. He worked tirelessly, fueled not by duty, but by love. And sometimes, late at night, after all the prayers were done, he would stand outside the chapel looking at the same stars he'd watched as a boy. He'd whisper, "If I die serving you, Lord, let it be with peace." In a world full of ambition and noise, his life was small, quiet, and ordinary. But it was precisely that ordinariness, his humble faith, his unwavering kindness, that made him extraordinary. Because the truest saints rarely make headlines while they're alive. They shine in silence until the moment their light is tested. The village of Dakhmat was small, a cluster of wooden houses hidden deep in the mountains, surrounded by coffee fields and the constant hum of cicadas. The red earth clung to everything, the walls, the sandals, even the air. When Father Joseph Changaktan first arrived, it was raining. The locals still remember that day. A skinny priest in a white habit, soaked from head to toe, smiling as if the downpour didn't exist. He parked his little motorbike under a tree, shook the water off, and said, "Let's pray." That was his way of entering any place, not with speeches, not with grand gestures, but with prayer. The villagers loved him immediately. He didn't act like an outsider. He ate what they ate, rice, cassava, dried fish, and sat with them on the ground. He learned a few words in their tribal dialect, enough to greet the children and make the elders laugh. They began calling him Cha Tan, Father Tan, the priest who never rested. Every morning, long before sunrise, he was already up, preparing Mass in the small chapel built from bamboo and corrugated tin. The altar was simple, a wooden table covered with a white cloth. Yet when he raised the host, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, the jungle outside went silent. Faith filled the air thicker than incense. He had a gift for presence, for being fully there. If someone was sick, he came. If someone was in trouble, he stayed. He once walked 5 kilometers through the rain just to bring communion to an old woman who couldn't leave her bed. People began to say, "If you call, Cha Tan will come, even if it's midnight." And they meant it. But missionary life in the highlands wasn't easy. The region was poor, isolated, and often tense. Land disputes, old tribal conflicts, and suspicion of outsiders created an undercurrent of unease. Some villagers whispered that outsiders, even priests, shouldn't meddle too much. Still, Father Tan wasn't afraid. He often said, "When you serve people, fear has no room to live." There were rumors. A few men in the area were unstable, angry, sometimes violent. He knew it. Everyone did. But when someone asked if he was worried, he simply smiled. He said, "If I am afraid to serve, then I am not a priest." Every Saturday, he spent hours in the small confessional behind the altar. The walls were thin, and outside you could hear chickens, laughter, and children playing. But inside, his voice was soft, patient, forgiving. One villager remembered, "He didn't scold us, he listened. You could feel peace come back to your heart when he spoke." Sometimes he would stay long after sunset, hearing confessions by flashlight when the power went out, because in those mountains, sin and sorrow didn't follow the clock. Then came June 2023, the month that would change everything. It was the rainy season again. The air was thick and heavy, and the roads had turned to mud. Still, Father Tang continued his work as usual. He was exhausted, but you'd never know it from his face. He had just finished baptizing a group of children and was preparing for the evening mass. A catechist, a lay helper, warned him to rest. He laughed. "We'll rest in heaven," he said, and kept arranging candles on the altar. That evening, he led prayers with his usual calm. No one could have guessed what was about to happen. The following day, June 13th,
2023, began like any other. The village woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of wet earth. Father Tang prepared for confessions after lunch. A few parishioners arrived early. He welcomed them with his usual warm nod, sitting behind the curtain in the small wooden booth. Outside, rain clouds gathered again. Inside, forgiveness was being spoken one person at a time. Then, sometime after 7 p.m., the silence of the chapel was broken. A man entered, disheveled, angry, eyes clouded with something no one could read. Some said he'd been mentally unstable for a long time. Others said it was deeper than madness, that something dark had taken hold of him. Father Tang didn't flinch. He looked up and greeted him as he would anyone. "Peace be with you." But there was no peace in the man's heart. He moved closer. Voices were heard, calm at first, then sharp, then desperate. And then, chaos. A flash of steel, a scream, the sound of benches crashing to the ground. The people nearby rushed in, but it was too late. Father Joseph Trangok Tao, the quiet priest who had given his life to the poor, was struck down behind the altar where he had served so many times before. He fell to the floor, bleeding, his white Dominican habit stained red. Those who were there say his last words were whispered through pain, not of anger or fear, but prayer. "Lord, forgive him." Moments later, his hands, the same hands that had held the Eucharist hours earlier, went still. Panic swept through the chapel. Some tried to stop the attacker. Others screamed for help. The rain outside began to fall harder, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. By the time the authorities arrived, Father Thang's body lay before the altar, the same place where he had just absolved sins. His blood mingled with the candle wax dripping from the stand beside him. A holy man had died in the act of mercy. The villagers wept through the night. No one could understand why such evil had entered their sacred place. But amid the grief, something profound happened. People gathered, hundreds of them, and began to pray, not for revenge, not for justice, but for peace. They prayed for the man who had killed him. They prayed for the church. They prayed for the courage to forgive, just as Father Thang had done in his final breath. In the following days, news spread across Vietnam and then the world. The Dominican order called him a martyr of mercy. The faithful called him the priest who died forgiving. And in Dak Mat, his small chapel became a place of pilgrimage. People came from distant villages, lighting candles where he fell. They touched the walls, prayed at the altar, and said they could still feel his presence, gentle, kind, unshaken. The church buried him with honor. His body, dressed in the same white robe, was laid to rest near the parish he loved. But his story didn't end in the ground. In every mountain village he served, people still speak of him as if he never left. The children remember his laughter. The elders remember his words. And when the rain comes, they say softly, "Our Father is walking the hills again." Because saints are not made in grand cathedrals or marble halls. They're born in places like Dak Mat, in the silence of service, in the courage to forgive, and in the blood of those who loved until the very end. The morning after the tragedy, the village of Dak Mat was quiet, painfully quiet. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still wet with sorrow. Inside the small chapel, the candles were still burning. Their flames trembled in the draught like fragile souls refusing to die. Someone had placed Father Joseph's sandals near the altar. They were worn, muddy, the soles cracked from miles of mountain paths. That's how people remembered him, not as a priest in grandeur, but as a servant who walked until his feet bled. Word spread quickly. Within hours, messages poured in from across Vietnam, from bishops, priests, and ordinary believers who had never met him but felt the weight of his death. The Dominican province in Vietnam released a statement. He died while hearing confessions, giving his life in the ministry of reconciliation.
May his sacrifice remind us of Christ's words, "No greater love than this, that one lay down his life for his friends." For the villagers, those words were not abstract theology. They were truth, written in blood. The day of his funeral, the road to Dakhmat was lined with people, hundreds of them, some walking for hours through the mud. The coffin was simple, wooden, covered with white flowers. A photo of Father Joseph rested on top, his familiar, gentle smile frozen in time. As the procession moved through the village, you could hear the cries of old women reciting the rosary, their voices trembling with love and disbelief. One man whispered, "He was too good for this world." Another said, "He didn't just talk about forgiveness, he died forgiving." During the funeral mass, the provincial superior of the Dominicans stood before the crowd and spoke softly. "Our brother Joseph died serving the poor, and even in his last breath, he spoke the words of the gospel. His blood was spilled on the altar, the very place where heaven meets earth. And in that moment, the cross came to Dakhmat."
People wept openly. Even those who were not Catholic stood outside the church, heads bowed in silence. When the bells tolled for his burial, their echoes rolled through the mountains, a sound that seemed to travel beyond the jungle into the heart of every believer who had ever doubted that holiness still existed in this world. After his death, something began to change. At first, it was subtle. A few villagers returning to confession, a few families reconciling after years of bitterness. But slowly, that small spark grew. Father Tang's story spread far beyond Kontum. Vietnamese newspapers, Catholic networks, and international media all told of the priest who had died while serving his people. For many, his death reopened a question long buried in the modern world. What does it truly mean to love without fear? In Rome, the Dominican leadership offered a mass in his memory. The superior general called him a witness of mercy in a violent world. And in parishes across Asia, his photo began to appear. A young priest in a white habit, smiling, a reminder that holiness is still possible, even now. But the most powerful legacy wasn't in Rome or Saigon. It was right there in Dakhmat. The villagers rebuilt the chapel walls that had been splattered with blood. They didn't erase the memory, they preserved it. Where he fell, they placed a simple plaque that reads, "Here, Father Joseph Tran Ngoc Tung, O.P., gave his life in service of God and his people." June 13th, 2023. Every evening when the sun sets and the sky turns gold, people gather in that same chapel to pray. They bring candles, flowers, and sometimes just silence. The children who once ran to greet him now kneel beside their parents, learning the prayers he taught. One woman who had once confessed to him her bitterness toward a family member said softly, "Before, I couldn't forgive. But when I think of how he forgave his killer, I have no excuse anymore." Forgiveness became his final sermon, and the village began to live it. Even the man who had killed him became the subject of prayer. In court, many villagers asked for mercy for him. They said Father Tang would not want revenge, he would want healing. It shocked the authorities, but for the people of Dakhmat, it was simple. They were only following the priest who had taught them what love really meant. Months passed, the seasons changed. Yet every time it rained, people said the same thing. Cha Tang is walking again. The rain that once drenched his habit now felt like a sign, a quiet reminder that love doesn't die, it just changes form. His grave became a place of pilgrimage. Young seminarians came to kneel and pray for courage. Farmers brought fruit from their fields as offerings of gratitude.
Even those who didn't believe came to sit in silence, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Because when a man dies with forgiveness on his lips, even unbelievers stop to listen.
Over time, stories began to spread. Stories of small miracles. A child recovering from illness after his family prayed at his grave. A young man freed from addiction after reading about him online. A priest who found the courage to return to a dangerous mission field because he remembered Father Ton's words. Fear has no room to live in a heart that serves. No one could prove the miracles, but maybe they didn't need to. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not in what happens to us, but in what awakens within us. In 2024, the Dominican Order in Vietnam began to gather testimonies for the possibility of his canonization, not as a saint of power, but as a saint of presence. The documents describe him simply. He lived quietly. He served joyfully. He forgave completely. And perhaps that's the truest holiness of all, not in great deeds or fame, but in the quiet, daily yes to love that costs everything. If you go to Doc Mott today, you can still hear his story told in whispers, around cooking fires, after evening mass, beneath skies filled with stars. An old woman might point to the chapel and say, "That's where our priest went home to God." A child might ask, "Will he come back?" And the mother will smile, holding the child close. He never left. Because some people's lives end with a period. But saints, their stories end with a heartbeat that never stops echoing. Father Joseph Tran Ngoc Thonc's death was not the end. It was the beginning, a reminder that even in a world of violence and despair, grace still finds a way to rise. And in that tiny village in Vietnam, under the shadow of the mountains, his voice still seems to whisper through the rain. Love without fear. Forgive without limit. Serve without counting the cost.
The neighbors said the fire started around 3 a.m. By the time firefighters arrived, the small wooden house was already a furnace. Flames licking the sky, windows glowing like open mouths. Inside, they found one body, burned beyond recognition. At first, everyone assumed it was an accident, a faulty wire, maybe a forgotten cigarette. But a week later, when the police came back with forensic results, everything changed. The man hadn't died from the fire. He had been poisoned before the flames ever reached him. And the person who had served him his last drink was his daughter. 1. A house built on fear. Her name was Lily Chen. To outsiders, she looked like any other 21-year-old. Quiet, polite, the kind of girl who always said thank you and avoided eye contact. But anyone who knew the Chens also knew that house was not a home. It was a cage. Her father, Henry Chen, was a man broken long before Lily was born. A failed mechanic, a drunk, and a man who believed anger was a kind of power. Every night, the same routine. A bottle of cheap whiskey, a storm of curses, and the sound of something breaking. Glass, plates, sometimes bones. Her mother stayed, out of fear, out of duty, maybe out of love that had rotted into habit. Her little brothers learned early how to hide under the bed when footsteps came down the hall. And Lily, she learned to endure. At 10 years old, she would bandage her mother's wounds. At 14, she took her brothers to school and whispered, "Don't cry, he's sleeping." At 16, she worked nights at a diner just to buy food when her father spent their last dollars on drink. But pain has a way of fermenting, like poison under the skin. You can only swallow so much before it burns through you. 2. When love meets the past. When she turned 19, she met Evan, a gentle college student who loved books and silence as much as she did. He was the first person who looked at her without judgment, who listened when she spoke. For the first time, she tasted what safety felt like. She started to dream of moving out, of a life where doors didn't slam and voices didn't scream. But the past doesn't fade quietly. Her father hated Evan. He called him weak, useless. He told Lily no man would ever love her because she was broken like her mother. And one night, when Evan came to pick her up, Henry punched him in the face. Lily ran between them, screaming, and for a moment, she saw something new in her father's eyes. Fear. Maybe he realized she was no longer the little girl he could control. Maybe that was the night she realized he'd never change. 3. The night everything broke. The weeks that followed were chaos. Her father grew paranoid, violent. He locked her phone away, threatened Evan, and beat her mother again for raising a traitor. Something inside Lily began to crack, quietly, like a wire under too much tension. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating.
The house reeked of spilled alcohol and burnt rage. And one night, as she cleaned the kitchen, she found a half-empty bottle of rat poison. At first, she froze. Then she stared at it for a long, silent minute, and something dark whispered inside her. What if it just stopped? It wasn't rage. It wasn't even revenge. It was exhaustion, the kind that blurs right and wrong until mercy and murder look the same. That night, she cooked her father's favorite meal, pork stew. She mixed the powder carefully, spoon by spoon, until the bitterness disappeared into the sauce. She served it with a quiet smile. And when he asked why she wasn't eating, she said, "I already ate." He finished half the bowl before collapsing. Lily sat there, motionless, watching the body that had once terrified her grow still. No tears, no screams, just silence. Then, as if guided by something ancient and cold, she walked to the kitchen, took the lighter her father always used, and set the curtains on fire. By the time she stepped outside, the flames were already dancing. She didn't run. She didn't call for help. She just stood there, watching everything that had ever hurt her turn to ash. 4. The aftermath. They found her 2 days later at a bus stop 40 miles away, her clothes still smelling faintly of smoke. When questioned, she confessed, calmly, without hesitation. "He would have killed us all eventually," she said. "I just ended it first." The court called her mentally unstable. The newspapers called her the poisoned daughter. But psychologists who examined her said something else. She was a survivor who had never been taught how to survive. Years of trauma had rewired her brain. When fear becomes your normal, your body stops recognizing safety, and pain becomes the only language you understand. In her mind, killing her father wasn't evil. It was escape. 5. The fire inside. Lily was sentenced to 15 years in a psychiatric facility. Evan visited her once. He said he forgave her. Her mother never came. Her brothers were taken in by relatives and never spoke her name again. But in the quiet of that white room, Lily began to write. Letters to her younger self. Letters to her father. Letters to God, if there was one. In one of her journals, found later by a counselor, she wrote, "I didn't kill him because I hated him. I killed him because every day he killed something in us, and I didn't know another way to make it stop. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see him sober. I see the man he could have been if someone had helped him before it was too late. Maybe that's what hell really is, realizing the love that could have been after you've burned it down." 6. The lesson beneath the ashes. This story isn't about just one girl. It's about thousands of children who grow up in houses that look normal from the outside, but inside, every day feels like walking on glass. It's about the mothers who stay because they have nowhere to go, the daughters who think silence is strength, the sons who confuse fear with love. Abuse doesn't always end in murder or fire. Most of the time, it ends quietly, in anxiety, broken trust, or the slow decay of self-worth. But Lily's story forces us to look deeper. What happens when trauma is inherited like a family heirloom? When pain passes from father to daughter and daughter to silence? No one is born violent. Even her father, Henry, was once a boy, maybe beaten by his own father, maybe taught that control equals love. And Lily, too, became what she feared most, the destroyer. Not because she was evil, but because she was never taught another way to stop the pain. 7. Beyond blame. It's easy to call her a monster, harder to admit that monsters are often made, not born. Every violent act begins as a wound, and some wounds, when left untreated, infect everything they touch. That doesn't mean what she did was right, but understanding it doesn't mean excusing it. Her story asks us a difficult question. How many tragedies could be prevented if someone had intervened sooner? If the teacher who saw the bruises had asked, if the neighbor who heard the screams had called, if the father had gotten help instead of a bottle. Maybe the fire wouldn't have happened. Maybe the little girl wouldn't have learned that death was her only escape. 8. What remains? Years later, when Lily was released, she went back to the place where the house once stood. The grass had grown over the foundation. Only a single blackened tree remained, twisted, half dead, but still standing. She sat beneath it for hours, tracing the dirt with her fingers. In the distance, children's laughter echoed from another yard. She closed her eyes and whispered, "It's over." But deep inside, she knew, fires never really die. They just move inward, burning quietly in the ones who survived. 9. The truth we don't want to see. This isn't a story about crime. It's a story about silence. About what happens when suffering becomes invisible because it's private or family business. About the damage done when society looks away. In America alone, over 10 million people experience domestic violence every year. And for every Lily, there are countless others still waiting for someone to notice, before it's too late. When love turns to control, when protection becomes possession, when pain is normalized, we are all responsible for the fire that follows. Because no child should have to choose between murder and survival. 10. The last page. If you ask people in that town today, most will still whisper about the fire. Some say it was the devil's work. Others say it was justice. But if you stand there long enough, where the ashes used to be, you'll notice something strange. Tiny wildflowers have started to grow from the cracks in the concrete. And maybe that's the real ending. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but rebirth. Because even from the darkest soil, life tries again. And perhaps in some small, quiet way, Lily's soul did too. Reflection. This story reminds us of one truth we often forget. Hurt people until someone shows them another way. If you or someone you know is trapped in abuse, please don't stay silent. Reach out. There are ways to heal before it turns into another tragedy. Because every story like Lily's starts with pain, but it doesn't have to end with fire.
Been served for Miguel and all of Rebecca's other victims. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.